Hey everyone. We just started What Was Life Really Like at a Medieval University? If you love what you see, don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe to join the community. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our global family come together. Let's dive into this adventure, right here, right now. By the early 1300s, a student at the University of Paris was statistically more likely to die from street violence than from disease. Yes, one of the world's earliest universities, a place we imagine filled with peaceful scholars and quiet libraries, was once notorious for drunken brawls, riots, and even battles against the city guards. That peaceful medieval education? Not even close. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, because the real life of a medieval university student was a wild mix of brilliance, poverty, danger, faith, ambition, chaos, and the birth of the academic world we know today. To understand how shocking this is, picture this. It's the year 1320. Europe has no formal high schools, no standardized tests, no dorm inspectors, no campus security, and definitely no Wi-Fi. A university isn't a building, it's a legally recognized community of masters and students, protected by the church, governed by their own rules, and often more powerful than the towns they lived in. And students? Many were teenagers, some as young as 13, leaving home for the first time, armed with nothing but a few coins, a cloak, a wax tablet, and dreams of becoming a priest, lawyer, physician, or scholar. But here's a number that surprises a lot of people. At the University of Bologna, one of the oldest in the world, more than 60% of students came from distant regions, many traveling hundreds of miles on foot or horseback just to reach the campus. That meant weeks of danger, hunger, cold, and uncertainty before they even reached their first lesson. And yes, statistically, a noticeable portion never made it back home. But let's slow down and walk right into this world. Imagine arriving in a medieval university town for the first time. The streets are muddy, loud, crowded with merchants shouting prices, horses kicking up dirt, and the constant ringing of church bells marking the rhythm of daily life. The air smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and sometimes not so pleasant things from the open sewage channels running along the streets. The university buildings aren't lecture halls like we know today. Many classes take place in rented rooms, church cloisters, or even a teacher's private house. Your first task? Finding a place to stay. There are no official dorms yet. Students lodge wherever they can, often in single rooms shared with 3, 4, sometimes 5 other students. Beds are expensive, so they sometimes sleep on straw, wrapped in their cloaks to stay warm in the winter. They are usually hungry. Bread and watered wine are the daily diet. Meat was expensive, and fish days, dictated by the church, were frequent. Many students were so poor they begged for food door to door. At the same time, rich noble sons strutted through the streets wearing bright cloaks, fine belts, and daggers that technically weren't allowed, but were carried anyway. Speaking of rules, medieval universities had a strict hierarchy. At Paris, for example, students were divided into nations, groups organized by geographic origin. Each nation elected leaders, enforced discipline, and often fought with other nations. Yes, fought. Not only fist fights but full street clashes, sometimes leading to multiple deaths before authorities intervened. And yet, for all this chaos, the academic side was astonishingly rigorous. A typical school day started before sunrise. Students stumbled out into the cold morning, lanterns in hand, heading toward their first lecture. Professors weren't called professors. They were masters. And lectures weren't conversations. The master read a text, usually Aristotle, the Bible, or works of church fathers, word by word, explaining meanings, grammar, arguments, and philosophy. Students weren't supposed to interrupt. They sat on wooden benches or even the floor, scribbling notes on wax tablets or parchment if they could afford it. There were no printed books. Every book was handwritten, and a single volume could cost more than a student's entire yearly expenses. So students often borrowed books from stationers, copying them by hand late into the night. The sound of scratching quills was the soundtrack of medieval academic life. But what really shocks modern students is the discipline. Missing class without a valid excuse? A fine. Disrupting a lecture? Bigger fine. Insulting a master? Expulsion. And the exams? Oh, the exams. There were no multiple choice tests, no quiet written exams. Everything was oral. You stood in front of your master and argued your knowledge while he tried to break your logic with counterarguments. Passing took stamina, memory, confidence, and speed of thought. Still, despite the pressure, something extraordinary was happening in these early universities. Ideas were exploding. The rediscovered works of Aristotle, translations from Arabic scholars like Avicenna and Averroes, New developments in law and medicine, and the passion of hundreds of curious young minds turned these chaotic institutions into the intellectual engines of medieval Europe. And remember how I said medieval universities had more power than you'd expect? Here's a stunning example. Students at many universities couldn't be arrested by city authorities. They were under the protection of church courts. So when conflicts broke out, and they did, townspeople felt helpless. At Oxford, students once started a riot after a tavern owner served them bad wine. The situation escalated so quickly that several townspeople were killed, and the king himself had to intervene. And yet, these same students could spend hours debating fine points of theology, laughing over philosophical paradoxes, reciting poetry, practicing Latin insults, or racing exams to see who could argue the best. It was a world of contradictions, danger and discovery, poverty and ambition, violence and intellectual brilliance. Picture a young student racing through the narrow streets of Paris, books under his cloak, late for a lecture. Picture another one sitting by candlelight, copying a text until his fingers ache. Picture a group of students arguing in the street about whether universals exist in reality or only in the mind. Picture them eating cheap meals in noisy taverns, falling asleep on their wax tablets, dreaming of someday becoming masters themselves. By the time we're done with this full journey, you'll see that medieval universities weren't just the ancestors of our modern campuses. They were the battlegrounds where the foundations of Western education were forged. Messy, loud, dangerous, brilliant, flawed, and utterly fascinating. And now that we've set the stage, we're going to dive deeper, much deeper, into what life was truly like for the students who shaped some of the most important institutions in human history. Now that you've stepped into the muddy streets and crowded alleys of a medieval university town, let's zoom in on the students themselves, because who these young scholars were, where they came from, and what they endured tells us everything about the strange, often unbelievable reality of medieval academic life. Imagine a teenager, let's call him Hughes, arriving in Paris around the year 1290. He's 14 years old. He's traveled more than 300 miles from Normandy, walking beside merchant caravans for safety, sleeping in barns when he could, and carrying everything he owns inside a small leather satchel. His parents scraped together just enough money to send him to study theology, hoping he might one day become part of the clergy, secure a stable life, and maybe even help elevate their family's status. Hughes isn't unusual. Medieval universities attracted students from all corners of Europe. At Oxford, nearly a third of the student body came from outside England. At Bologna, it was common to hear conversations in Latin, Italian, German, French, and even Spanish on the same street. Latin was the official university language, your ticket to learning. If you couldn't speak Latin, you weren't even allowed to attend lectures. Now picture Hughes on his first night in Paris. He doesn't know anyone. He doesn't know where to sleep. He doesn't know which streets are safe. And trust me, some of them were absolutely not safe. University districts were notorious for crime, especially robbery and tavern fights. But that first night he finds a lodging house near the Rue du Four, Straw Street, named after the straw scattered across classroom floors for students to sit on. This street, packed with taverns, booksellers, and lecture rooms, was the heart of the University of Paris. By day, students argued loudly about philosophy. By night, the same students often caused trouble. Imagine Hughes lying awake on a straw mattress, still wearing his cloak because he has no blanket, listening to footsteps and shouts outside his window. This is his new home. But Hughes doesn't have time to feel sorry for himself. Before dawn, he has to be at his first class. Medieval lectures were precise. They started with the ringing of bells from nearby churches. Students hurried across the cold cobblestones, holding candles or lanterns, trying not to slip on the ice in winter or mud in spring. If you arrived late, the master didn't stop reading. He didn't repeat anything. You simply missed it, and you paid for it later when you had to defend the argument in class. Hughes enters a cramped lecture room, the air thick with the smell of wax and damp wool cloaks drying near the door. The master sits at a raised desk, reading from a handwritten manuscript chained to the table so no one can steal it. Books were so valuable that losing even a single one could destroy a scholar's entire career. This is where medieval students truly felt the shock of university life. Education was not entertainment. It was discipline. It was intellectual combat. And everyone in the room knew it. The master begins reading Aristotle's Metaphysics. Word by word. Slowly. Clearly. Each sentence is followed by explanation, interpretation, and commentary. Students copy as fast as they can, dipping quills into ink, scratching on parchment, trying to keep up. They aren't just learning philosophy, they're learning how to think in a structured, logical way. This is the birthplace of the scholastic method, a system of reasoning still used today in legal training and academic debate. But here's something surprising. Many medieval students didn't understand everything they wrote down. Some couldn't even afford parchment and had to rely entirely on listening. Others rented books overnight and copied them by candlelight, risking fire hazards in their wooden rooms. Some fell asleep at their desks, burned their fingertips on dripping wax, or got reprimanded for losing focus. And yet, for all the difficulty, the excitement was real. Students like Hughes were suddenly exposed to ideas that had shaped civilizations. They heard debates on whether the universe was eternal, whether angels could occupy space, whether humans had free will, whether language shaped reality, and how logic could determine truth. These weren't boring academic topics. They were radical, dangerous, and at times, even forbidden. But medieval student life wasn't all seriousness. Let's talk about the nations, the student organizations that divided the university population. Paris had four: French, Norman, Picard, and English. Each had its own leadership, traditions, rules, and, unfortunately, rivalries. Nations fought over everything: money, tavern debts, exam procedures, even sports. And these fights could turn deadly. It wasn't unusual for nations to arm themselves with sticks, clubs, and stones, rushing into the streets shouting battle cries. Imagine being Hughes and suddenly hearing a roar from outside. He runs out to see two nations clashing in the alleyway, students against students, masters trying to break it up, shopkeepers barricading their doors, and townspeople watching in fear. This wasn't an exception. It was part of the culture. Ironically, the one thing students agreed on was complaining about the townspeople. They thought local merchants overcharged them. They believed innkeepers watered down wine. They accused butchers of selling rotten meat. And when conflicts escalated, students invoked their legal protection. Only church courts could judge them. Not the city. Not the king. Imagine the frustration of a Parisian shopkeeper whose window was smashed by drunk students, and he couldn't get justice because the offenders claimed clerical immunity. This tense relationship occasionally exploded into massive riots, some so serious that kings, bishops, and even the Pope became involved. When students went on strike, universities shut down entirely. Lectures stopped. Masters fled. The economy of the town collapsed. Students wielded enormous power, more than modern students could ever imagine. And yet, behind this chaos, something incredible was happening. Out of these messy, unpredictable environments emerged some of the most important intellectuals in history: Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, Peter Abelard, and later, Marsilius of Padua. Their ideas shaped theology, politics, science, law, and philosophy for centuries. Which raises an important question: how did students survive long enough to become scholars of such influence? The answer lies in their resilience. They were hungry, cold, often scared, often broke, but they were determined. They studied late into the night. They debated fiercely. They memorized entire books. They endured poverty, illness, violence, and homesickness. And through all of it, they believed that knowledge was worth suffering for. We're only scratching the surface. Because next, we're going deeper into how these students lived day to day, what they ate, how they studied, what their social lives were like, and the surprising freedoms and dangers they experienced that would shock modern students today. If you've ever complained about cafeteria food, wait until you hear what medieval university students endured. Because the daily life of someone like Hughes wasn't just difficult, it was a constant negotiation with hunger, exhaustion, stress, and the unpredictable chaos of a town that didn't always want him there in the first place. Let's start with what he ate. A wealthy noble student might enjoy decent meals: bread, cheese, fish, wine, and occasionally chicken or pork. But most students weren't wealthy. Many came from humble families supported by small stipends or charity. They lived on the cheapest food available: rye bread, pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, onions, and whatever they could afford on the side. Meat was rare. Eggs were expensive. And fresh fruit? Almost a luxury. The diet led to constant hunger. Students joked in Latin about having more books than meals, more debts than coins, and more exams than hours of sleep. Hughes often stood in long lines at communal kitchens for free bread. On difficult days, he might beg for leftovers from taverns or churches, a surprisingly common practice among poorer scholars. Now imagine this: between 20% and 40% of medieval students lived below the poverty line. They weren't glamorous intellectuals. They were young, desperate, freezing in winter, sweating in summer, and walking miles across the city every day. They patched their cloaks with scraps of cloth. They reused wax tablets until they were smooth. They kept their only pair of shoes until the soles tore apart. Yet, despite the poverty, medieval university towns were lively, vibrant centers of youth. Let's step into a typical day. After morning lectures, students moved to disputations, debate-style sessions where they practiced logic, argumentation, and rhetorical skills. These were intense. The master presented a problem. Can the human soul be separated from the body? Or, does the will move the intellect or the intellect the will? Students took sides, raising objections, offering counterarguments, citing Aristotle or Augustine. Imagine Hughes standing in a crowded room, heart pounding, sweat on his forehead as he argues in Latin against students older and more experienced than him. The disputation isn't just academic, it's public, competitive, and sometimes humiliating. If he stumbles, others laugh. If he succeeds, he earns respect. By midday, classes end. Students rush to taverns or food stalls. Taverns are not like modern bars. They're noisy, smoky, chaotic places filled with merchants, sailors, clergy, travelers, and groups of students arguing at wooden tables. The cheapest wine is watered down. The food is salty. But taverns are the social hubs of university life. Here, students make friends, form study groups, gossip about strict masters, compare notes, argue over theology, or sometimes get into trouble. Drunkenness is common. Fights erupt over insults. Tavern owners sometimes refuse to serve students because they rarely pay their debts. But the energy is infectious. Imagine dozens of young minds tense from study, releasing their stress in bursts of laughter, debate, and music. And yes, medieval students loved entertainment. Wandering musicians performed in the streets. Jugglers, storytellers, and acrobats entertained crowds. Students played dice, sang drinking songs, wrote poetry, and even staged small plays. Though the church frowned upon gambling and drunkenness, enforcement was inconsistent. Despite their wild reputation, students also faced strict moral and academic expectations. The church monitored behavior closely. Breaking curfew, carrying weapons, disturbing the peace, skipping mass, or engaging in forbidden relationships could result in penalties. But enforcement varied by region. Bologna, for instance, had a student-run government, meaning students had enormous freedom. Paris, on the other hand, was more controlled by the church. Now let's take a closer look at student lodgings. Picture a dim room with cracked walls and a low ceiling. 2 or 3 straw mattresses lie on the floor. A wooden chest holds clothing. A tiny window leaks cold air. There's no fireplace, just a small brazier for heat if they can afford coal. At night, students study by candlelight. The wax drips onto their hands. The flame flickers. The room smells of ink, parchment, and damp cloth. Imagine Hughes hunched over his notes, copying fragments of Aristotle. His roommates whisper as they memorize lines for tomorrow's disputation. Outside, the street echoes with drunken laughter. Someone knocks over a barrel. A dog barks. A bell rings from a nearby church tower. This is the soundtrack of medieval student life. Chaos outside, silence inside, minds burning with ideas. But beneath daily routines, a deeper tension shaped the medieval university world. The tension between students and townspeople. Townspeople often resented students for driving up rent, causing trouble in taverns, disrupting markets, and hiding behind church immunity when they committed crimes. Students accused locals of overcharging them, cheating them, or treating them unfairly. Conflicts escalated often. Let me take you to one of the most dramatic events in academic history. In 1229 in Paris, a simple tavern argument between students and locals turned violent. Several were injured. In retaliation, town guards beat a group of students to death. Outraged professors and students demanded justice. When the authorities refused, the entire university went on strike. Lectures stopped. Thousands of students fled the city. Markets collapsed. Churches struggled. The king panicked. Eventually, the Pope intervened, favoring the university, and forced reforms that strengthened academic autonomy. This wasn't an isolated incident. In Oxford in 1355, a dispute over the quality of wine sparked a 2-day battle between students and townspeople, leaving almost 100 people dead. For centuries afterward, Oxford annually fined the town for the bloodshed. So yes, medieval universities were places of learning, but they were also battlegrounds of culture, class, religion, economics, and youth. Despite this, the intellectual achievements were remarkable. Students studied grammar, logic, theology, law, medicine, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. They memorized entire texts. They debated profound questions. They learned how to argue with precision and confidence. And those skills shaped governments, courts, monasteries, and universities for centuries. But we haven't yet explored the most important part, the emotional reality. Loneliness, homesickness, pressure, fear of failure. Hughes writes letters to his family telling them he is doing well, even when he is exhausted, hungry, and overwhelmed. Yet he doesn't give up. None of them do. They endure because the dream of knowledge burns so brightly. We're now getting closer to the heart of the medieval university experience. The exams, the rituals, the friendships, the dangers, and the fragile hope that carried students through years of struggle. By now you've seen the daily grind, the hunger, the debates, the chaotic taverns, and the endless nights of candlelit studying. But nothing defined a medieval student's life more than the exams. These weren't modern tests where you fill in bubbles or type answers on a screen. No, these were dramatic, public, intellectual duels. And they determined everything. Let's step right into the world of medieval examinations. Imagine Hughes waking up before dawn on the most important day of his life. His final disputation. The moment that will decide whether he becomes a bachelor, an officially recognized scholar, who can continue toward a master's degree. He hasn't slept well for days. His classmates have been quizzing him non-stop, firing questions at him in Latin. He hasn't had a proper meal in almost a week because nerves killed his appetite. Exams in medieval universities weren't isolated events. They were long, ritualistic ordeals shaped by centuries of tradition. And they were almost entirely oral. Hughes enters a large hall filled with students, masters, scribes, and sometimes even curious townspeople who came to watch the intellectual combat. It feels more like a courtroom than a classroom. Everyone speaks in Latin, the universal language of scholarship. At the front sits the presiding master. Beside him are two examiners known as opponents, the challengers. Their job is to attack Hughes' arguments, poke holes in his reasoning, and test his knowledge to the breaking point. It's not friendly. It's not supportive. It's a battle of minds. Hughes stands at a wooden podium, trembling slightly but determined. The master announces the question of the day: whether the soul's knowledge of universals precedes its knowledge of particulars. A philosophical question rooted in Aristotle's metaphysics and interpreted through Christian theology. Hughes must speak clearly, confidently, and logically. If he stammers or hesitates, the room will feel it. He begins his respondio, his response structured in 3 parts. First, he states his position. Second, he provides arguments supporting it. Third, he anticipates counterarguments and dismantles them. But the opponents don't stay quiet. They interrupt. They attack. They bring up obscure references from Augustine, Boethius, and Averroes. They push him into corners, forcing him to defend positions he barely understands under pressure. Imagine standing in front of a crowd while 2 experts try to break your logic for over an hour. Imagine doing all this in Latin, a language that isn't your mother tongue. Students fainted during exams. Some collapsed from hunger. Some burst into tears. But passing meant everything. If Hughes succeeded, he earned the title of baccalaureus, a bachelor, and could teach lower-level students, earning money to support himself. But the journey didn't end there. To become a master, the medieval equivalent of modern professor, he would endure even more exams, years of lecturing, and public disputations. And all of this unfolded in a time when books were almost magical objects. A single academic manuscript could take a scribe months to copy. Students hand-copied texts late into the night, bending over tables while candles burned dangerously close to parchment. Many couldn't afford parchment at all, so they rented books by the hour from stationers, early book lenders regulated by the university itself. That's right, the medieval university had a proto-library system long before public libraries became common. But even with manuscripts, learning wasn't passive. Students memorized vast amounts of material, not because professors demanded it but because it was the only way to ensure the knowledge wasn't lost. Books were rare. If you didn't memorize a text before your rental time ended, you might never see it again. Let's switch scenes for a moment. It's winter. Snow falls on the rooftops of Paris. The streets are silent except for the crunch of boots on frozen mud. Hughes sits in his room with 2 friends, crowded around a small brazier for warmth. One reads aloud from a borrowed book while the other 2 scrape wax from their tablets to reuse them. Their breath fogs in the cold. The candle flickers. Outside, church bells echo through the night. These are the moments students remember most. Not the riots, not the hunger, but the camaraderie. A shared dream. A shared struggle. A shared desire to rise above their circumstances. But alongside these friendships were the teachers, masters who shaped their worldview. Some were brilliant, inspiring figures who challenged students to think for themselves. Others were strict, humorless, and frightening. A few were legends in their lifetimes, attracting thousands of students. At Bologna, the great jurist Irnerius revolutionized the study of Roman law, drawing crowds from across Europe. In Paris, Thomas Aquinas and his master Albertus Magnus debated philosophy that would influence centuries of thought. Picture being a young student sitting in a crowded church hall, listening to a master whose ideas might reshape the future. Picture writing down every word, knowing it might be quoted for generations. And yet, even masters weren't always respected. Students were notorious for mocking them in taverns, imitating their voices, or writing satirical poems. Some masters complained that students never paid for lectures on time. Others feared walking through town at night, knowing hostile townspeople or drunk students might attack them. Still, the intellectual spark was real. Medieval universities were the engines of European knowledge. They produced theologians, doctors, lawyers, architects, astronomers, poets, and scientists. And the surprising part? Most students didn't graduate. Many attended for a few years, learned what they needed, Latin, logic, rhetoric, and left for careers in the church, government, trade, or medicine. A medieval degree wasn't about getting a certificate. It was about gaining the tools to navigate an increasingly complex world. But we still haven't explored the part that shocks modern viewers the most: the discipline, the punishments, the strange rules governing behavior, clothing, relationships, and even haircuts. Yes, medieval universities had rules about hair. And next, we're going deep into the unexpected. What students were forbidden to do, what they were required to do, and the strange, sometimes hilarious, sometimes terrifying punishments that shaped campus life. Before we go deeper into the intellectual world of medieval universities, it's time to reveal something most people never expect. These early academic institutions had rules so strict, so oddly specific, and sometimes so downright bizarre that modern students would barely believe them were real. But they were fully enforced and often punished with surprising severity. Let's return to Paris and follow Hugues through the regulations that governed his life from the moment he entered the university community. First, the clothing. Every student had to wear a long gown called a capa, usually dark and plain. Bright colors were discouraged. Flashy belts, jewelry, embroidered cloaks, anything that signaled wealth or vanity, was technically forbidden. But nobles ignored these rules constantly, walking through campus dressed like medieval influencers, while poorer students complained that fashion was becoming a distraction from learning. And then came the haircut rules. Students were required to keep their hair modestly short. Long, styled, or fashionable haircuts were banned because they were seen as arrogant and worldly. Some universities even specified that hair could not cover the ears. A scholar was expected to look humble, serious, and disciplined, whether he felt that way or not. Now let's talk money. Medieval universities had rules about what students could spend money on. Gambling was banned. Extravagant dinners were banned. Excessive drinking was banned. But taverns made so much profit off students that enforcement was a joke. Records show countless cases of students losing everything: books, shoes, cloaks, even their bets, in dice games. Imagine Hugues watching a friend bet his last coin on a roll of dice in a smoky tavern, the crowd shouting, the tension thick. When the friend loses, he laughs, shrugs, and borrows money from someone else. Because debt was almost a badge of honor among students. A study from medieval Bologna estimated that up to 70% of students owed money to tavern owners, book lenders, tailors, or landlords. Debts were so common that local authorities created special procedures just for student debtors. Now, the rules around behavior. Fighting was banned, but fights happened almost daily. Carrying weapons was banned, but knives and daggers were hidden inside cloaks. Staying out past curfew was banned, but students roamed the streets at all hours. Some universities banned visiting certain neighborhoods known for gambling, prostitution, or tavern violence. But naturally, those were the areas students visited most. In Oxford, a regulation once listed over 30 specific taverns that students were forbidden to enter. They memorized the list not to avoid them, but to know exactly where the good entertainment was. The church also imposed moral rules. Students were expected to attend Mass regularly. Missing Mass could lead to fines. Swearing was punished. Blasphemy was punished severely. Unauthorized romantic relationships were discouraged, and in some cases could result in expulsion. But here's the twist. Students were clerics in status, even if they didn't intend to become priests. That meant they couldn't be tried in civilian courts. This special legal status infuriated townspeople, who saw students as troublemakers protected by unfair laws. Imagine Hugues walking down the street toward class, passing shopkeepers who glare at him. They whisper, "There goes another scholar who thinks the law doesn't apply to him." This tension shaped daily life. And then there were the academic rules, far more intimidating. Students were expected to memorize enormous portions of Latin text. They had to participate in disputations. They had to show respect to their masters. They had to submit to strict discipline. Punishments ranged from fines to flogging, depending on the university. Yes, some universities permitted corporal punishment for younger students, especially those in grammar programs. At the University of Paris, missing a lecture, without a valid reason, could result in a fine equal to several meals. Constant absence meant you were forced out. Speaking disrespectfully to a master could lead to public humiliation or expulsion. One historical record describes a student forced to stand in front of his classmates holding a candle while confessing his misbehavior, an early version of campus shaming. But despite all this, medieval student life wasn't only hardship and rules. There was freedom too. Students traveled, explored, debated in taverns and formed close-knit social circles. They wrote poetry, played music, carved graffiti into university walls, and celebrated feast days with enthusiasm. They organized festivals, dressed in costumes, performed comic plays, and formed groups around shared interests. And then there were the student pranks, a tradition older than any modern fraternity. One medieval Oxford story tells of students stealing a town bell and hiding it on campus, forcing the church to negotiate its return. Another record describes students dressing like devils during carnival, terrifying townspeople but making their friends laugh hysterically. A group in Bologna once released a donkey wearing a student cap into the middle of a lecture just to see how the master would react. These moments don't appear in textbooks, but they were real and part of the student spirit. Young, chaotic, unpredictable, brilliant. Now let's return to our fictional but historically grounded student, Hughes. He's navigating rules, debts, strict teachers, demanding classes, and the emotional ups and downs of teenage life away from home. Some days he feels unstoppable, mastering complex arguments and impressing older students. Other days he feels lost, overwhelmed, and lonely. Letters from medieval students show that these emotions were universal. Some begged their parents for money. Others bragged about their achievements. Many complained about the cold, the food, the prices, and the behavior of other students. One letter from a student in 1220 reads, "I am freezing. I have no cloak. My shoes are broken. I cannot buy parchment. But I am learning much." Another student wrote to his mother, "The wine is terrible, the bread is worse, but the books, oh mother, the books." These glimpses reveal the true heart of medieval academic life, a combination of hardship and passion, discomfort and discovery. And something else was happening beneath the surface. Universities were transforming Europe. They weren't just schools, they were engines producing lawyers who would shape kingdoms, theologians who would debate doctrines, physicians who would advance medicine, and scholars who would frame the structure of knowledge itself. But there's still more to explore. Next, we're traveling inside the faculty system: theology, law, medicine, and arts. What did students actually learn? How were classes structured? What ideas dominated the curriculum? And how did these subjects shape the medieval world? Get ready, because the academic content itself is just as dramatic as student life. Now that we've explored the discipline, the rules, the pranks, the chaos, and the emotional strain, it's time to step into the intellectual core of the medieval university, the curriculum itself. Because what students learned wasn't just academic content. It was the foundation of European thinking for centuries. And it shaped theology, medicine, law, government, science, and philosophy in ways we still feel today. Let's start with the structure of medieval learning. Every university had 4 faculties: arts, theology, law, and medicine. But almost all students began in the same place, the Faculty of Arts. Think of it as the medieval version of general education. And trust me, it was far more intense than any modern core curriculum. The arts faculty focused on the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 groups: the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric; the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. These weren't just subjects. They were the pillars of medieval intellectual life. Grammar meant mastering Latin, not just speaking it but analyzing texts with precision. Students had to read ancient Latin authors, understand every grammatical structure, and explain why each word was chosen. Logic was the heart of scholastic education. Students learned how to build arguments, identify fallacies, and challenge assumptions. They studied Aristotle's logic line by line, memorizing structures like syllogisms and learning to tear apart arguments with surgical precision. Rhetoric taught them how to persuade, how to speak beautifully, how to write with elegance, how to shape ideas so they moved an audience. The quadrivium expanded the mind further. Arithmetic wasn't just numbers. It was philosophical. Numbers as symbols of divine order. Geometry wasn't just shapes. It underpinned architecture, land measurement, and the design of cathedrals. Music wasn't musical performance. It was the mathematics of harmony, the study of cosmic order through sound. Astronomy was part science, part divinity. Students charted the movements of stars and planets, believing celestial patterns reflected divine design. Imagine Hughes sitting in a lecture on astronomy, listening as a master describes how the motion of the heavens reflects the perfection of God. Outside, the sky is gray with winter clouds. Inside, the students peer over wax tablets, sketching the paths of planets they've never actually seen through a telescope. Their understanding of the cosmos comes from texts, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Islamic scholars, handed down through generations. But the arts faculty was only the beginning. Students who completed it, and survived the exams, could specialize in law, medicine, or theology. Let's walk into each world. First, law. Bologna was the global center of legal study. Students traveled from across Europe to hear masters interpret the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Roman law code rediscovered only decades earlier. Imagine a crowded lecture hall with merchants' sons, future judges, and government officials taking notes as a master explains contracts, inheritance, property rights, and marriage laws. Law students often became some of the wealthiest graduates because kings, nobles, and merchants desperately needed legal expertise. Next, medicine. Medieval medical students studied anatomy, humoral theory, herbs, diagnosis, and the writings of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. These universities didn't have cadaver labs like modern medical schools. Instead, students sometimes watched public dissections, rare events where a criminal's body was examined under strict church supervision. The room would be packed, every student holding his breath as the master pointed to organs with a stick, comparing them to descriptions in ancient texts. Imagine Hughes, if he chose medicine, standing in a cold hall filled with the smell of herbs used to mask the scent of the corpse. A scribe records the master's words. Students whisper arguments about the nature of disease, some insisting illness comes from imbalanced humors, others from spiritual forces. Knowledge was growing but slowly. Then, theology, the queen of the sciences. Theology was the most prestigious faculty. Students here grappled with the deepest questions imaginable. The nature of God, the meaning of salvation, the structure of the universe, the interpretation of Scripture. Theologians were intellectual giants. Their disputations drew massive crowds. They debated predestination, the Trinity, the will, the soul, everything that defined medieval Christian worldview. Imagine walking into the Cathedral School of Notre Dame in Paris. Thousands of candles flicker. The stone walls seem to absorb the sound of chanting. A master like Thomas Aquinas or Bonaventure stands before the crowd, unraveling mysteries of faith with razor-sharp logic. Students sit on the floor, cloaks wrapped around their legs, listening with awe. Every word might become doctrine. Every argument might shape the church. Theology wasn't just a subject, it was destiny. But beneath the prestige, the reality was still harsh. Students lived with constant pressure. Tuition fees, food costs, book rentals, exam deadlines, and the expectation to memorize enormous volumes of information. A theology student might spend weeks analyzing a single passage of Scripture. And yet something remarkable happened during this era. Medieval universities became melting pots of ideas. Christian, Jewish, and Islamic intellectual traditions blended. Translations flowed from Arabic to Latin. Astrolabes and medical texts from the Islamic world reshaped astronomy and medicine. Roman law revived. Aristotle's philosophy, lost to Europe for centuries, returned with explosive impact. It's easy to think medieval Europe was closed, rigid, or anti-intellectual. But the universities were the exact opposite. They were crossroads of cultures, ideas, and debates. And through this intellectual exchange, Europe experienced one of its greatest periods of transformation. But there was something else driving that transformation. Something human, emotional, and often overlooked. The mentorship. Let's return to Hughes again. He finally meets a teacher who sees his potential. A master who encourages him, pushes him, challenges his ideas without crushing his spirit. Medieval masters weren't always kind, but when a student found a supportive teacher, it could change his entire life. Imagine Hughes staying after class to ask a question. The master lowers his voice, explains a difficult text, and gives him advice on how to strengthen his argument for an upcoming disputation. That moment, one moment, is enough to fuel Hughes through weeks of hardship. Medieval letters show that students often developed deep loyalty toward beloved masters. They admired their wisdom, their discipline, their moral strength. Some even followed them from city to city when political or academic disputes forced masters to relocate. Education wasn't just a system. It was a relationship. But we still haven't explored one of the most defining parts of medieval university life. The constant danger. The street violence. The riots. The political power struggles. And the life-threatening reality students faced far more often than modern students would ever imagine. In the next section, we're diving into the unpredictable, dangerous, and sometimes deadly environment that shaped medieval academic life, and the dramatic events that changed the course of university history. We've explored the classrooms, the curriculum, the debates, the teachers, and the strict rules, but we still haven't stepped into the most shocking part of medieval university life, the danger. Because when we imagine universities, we think of peaceful campuses, quiet libraries, and safe dorms. But medieval universities? They were often the opposite. Let's start with this brutal reality. The average medieval student walked the streets with a real chance of being beaten, robbed, stabbed, or killed. Violence wasn't a rare exception. It was a recurring part of student life. And the roots of this danger ran deep. Political, social, legal, and emotional tensions all collided in these dense university towns. Imagine Hughes leaving a tavern one evening, books tucked under his cloak. The sky is dark. Wind chills his fingers. Lanterns flicker along the alleyways. Suddenly, laughing voices echo behind him. Local apprentices heading home. They see his gown, recognize him as a student, and immediately, tension. Townspeople often resented students. They blamed them for rising rent prices, misbehavior, unpaid debts, and a sense of arrogance. Students blamed townspeople for cheating them on prices, insulting them, or threatening their freedom. It was a powder keg waiting to ignite. A single insult, a spilled drink, or a disagreement over money could start a fight that spread through the streets like fire. And the reason things escalated so quickly? Students had legal immunity. Because they were considered clerics, they could only be tried by church courts, far more lenient than secular courts. If a student beat someone, destroyed property, or even killed someone, townspeople knew the punishment would be mild. This created resentment that simmered constantly. Let's step into one of the most infamous incidents in academic history. Paris, 1229. It's carnival season. Days of festivity, drinking, music, and celebration. Students are out in taverns, celebrating loudly as young people do. Then it happens. A dispute between a group of students and a tavern owner over the quality of wine. Words are exchanged. Voices rise. Someone throws a punch. The fight spills into the street. Local authorities arrive, already angry at student behavior, and they don't hold back. They beat several students brutally. 2 die. The university erupts in outrage. Students go on strike. Professors join them. Lectures stop. Thousands leave Paris entirely. The city's economy suffers. For 2 years, Paris essentially loses its university. Finally, the Pope intervenes, siding with the university. Reforms are made to protect scholars even more. It's almost unbelievable today. A brawl over wine reshaped the future of one of the world's greatest universities. But Paris wasn't alone. Let's travel to Oxford, 1355. It's Saint Scholastica's day. 2 students enter a tavern. They complain that the wine tastes bad. They insult the tavern owner. He insults them back. They throw their drinks in his face. A fight breaks out. Town guards intervene. But this time the fight becomes a city-wide battle. For 2 days, students and townspeople engage in full-scale violence. Arrows fly. Bells ring. Armed groups chase each other through the streets. Dozens die. Some estimates say up to 100. After the chaos, the King of England punishes the town, not the university. For centuries afterward, the town of Oxford had to pay a fine to the university every year. Imagine being a student walking through campus knowing your institution is powerful enough to defeat the town in a legal battle after a riot. That's the world medieval students lived in. Now let's step back into the daily reality. It wasn't just riots. Everyday violence was common. There were bandits lurking outside city gates, waiting for students traveling alone. There were drunken brawls in taverns. There were fights with apprentices and craftsmen, who felt threatened or disrespected by students. And there were nighttime risks, dimly lit streets, narrow alleys, no police force, no emergency services, and no medical treatment beyond basic remedies. A medieval student walking home at night carried real fear. Imagine Hughes moving quickly through a dark alley, listening for footsteps behind him. Imagine him gripping his belt tightly, hoping no one jumps him. Imagine him seeing shadows move and wondering if it's thieves, or just another student. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Records from medieval universities list countless student injuries: broken arms, stab wounds, head trauma, arrow wounds, crushed fingers, even deaths from brawls gone too far. And yet, students stayed. They learned. They persisted. This constant danger shaped their psychology. They grew tougher, sharper, more alert. They bonded with classmates through shared struggle. They formed groups for protection. They walked in pairs or trios. They learned which streets were safe and which taverns avoided trouble. But danger wasn't only physical. Students also faced emotional danger: homesickness, isolation, depression, exhaustion. Letters from the time reveal this with heartbreaking honesty. One student wrote, "I am surrounded by people, yet I have no friend." Another wrote to his father, "I fear failing more than I fear hunger." And another said, "The nights are longest when I think of home." These voices remind us that behind the violence and the bravado, many students were just children, 13, 14, 15 years old, far from home, trying to survive in an overwhelming world. Now let's expand the lens beyond individual students. Medieval universities weren't just dangerous for the students, they were dangerous for the towns around them. Entire economies depended on the academic population. Thousands of students meant thousands of paying customers for bakers, butchers, landlords, tailors, scribes, and taverns. But with money came conflict. A rise in rents caused poverty among locals. Student pranks damaged property. Disputes over prices led to fights. Universities gained political power, influencing kings and popes. When universities went on strike, economies collapsed. These towns weren't hosting peaceful campuses. They were hosting explosive communities of ambitious, stressed, hungry, brilliant young men who could transform a city or tear it apart. And here's the surprising twist. Most students were proud of this chaotic culture. They described their university years as a mix of suffering and glory. They wrote poetry about brotherhood, debates, wine, hunger, and breaking rules. They saw their struggles not as burdens, but as initiation into a life of learning, power, and influence. Medieval university culture became legendary because it was extreme, unpredictable, and intellectually electric. But there's still one more dimension to explore. What happened when students finally left? What careers did they enter? How did their university years shape medieval society? And what legacy did these institutions leave behind that we still feel today? In the next section, we're stepping into the world beyond graduation, and the true impact of medieval universities on the world. After years of hunger, cold, danger, exams, endless lectures, and the constant struggle to survive, a medieval student who finally completed his studies stepped into a world ready to use, and sometimes exploit, his education. Graduation wasn't a single event. It was a series of rituals. If Hughes managed to pass his disputations, survive the arts curriculum, and earn his bachelor's degree, he still had years of study ahead if he wanted to become a master. But once he crossed that threshold, the world opened to him in ways that seemed almost unimaginable compared to where he started. Let's walk with Hughes as he prepares to leave university life behind. He's older now, maybe 20, maybe 25, depending on how long his studies took. He's tougher, sharper, more confident. His Latin is flawless. His mind has been sharpened by argument, logic, and hardship. He has faced hunger, violence, ridicule, and academic pressure. And now he stands on the edge of a world that desperately needs men like him. Because medieval universities didn't exist to give students personal fulfillment, they existed to produce professionals. There were 4 primary paths university graduates took: the church, government and bureaucracy, law, medicine. Each path came with its own challenges and rewards, and each one shaped medieval society in profound ways. Let's start with the most common, the church. Medieval Europe relied heavily on educated clergy. Priests, monks, bishops, scribes, they all needed literacy, knowledge of scripture, and the ability to interpret doctrine. A student like Hughes, trained in logic and theology, could move into monastic life or become a parish priest. If he was ambitious and lucky, he might become a bishop or an advisor to a king. The church loved university-trained clergy because they could read, write, argue, and administer. They could copy manuscripts, interpret canon law, and settle disputes. Many became the backbone of medieval ecclesiastical administration. But not every student wanted religious life. Many chose government. And here's where medieval universities transformed Europe. Until the rise of universities, kings and nobles often relied on tradition, instinct and their personal circle for governance. But by the 1200s and 1300s something changed. Governments needed educated men, people who could draft contracts, negotiate treaties, interpret laws, and administer complex territories. Students who studied law or the arts became clerks, bureaucrats, diplomats, tax assessors, royal secretaries, and advisors. They brought logic, structure, and written records to governments that had previously relied on oral traditions. They shaped the development of states, strengthening administrative systems that became the foundation of modern Europe. The third path was law. Legal graduates were in high demand. They became judges, lawyers, notaries, legal scholars, and advisors to kings and popes. The rediscovery of Roman law, thanks to the University of Bologna, revolutionized European legal culture. Contracts, property rights, inheritance laws, marriage rules, all became more structured and standardized because of university-trained legal experts. Law students were often the highest earners among medieval graduates. Their expertise was rare, valuable, and essential for running kingdoms, churches, and cities. The fourth path was medicine. Medical graduates became physicians for nobles, kings, monasteries, or towns. They studied anatomy, humors, herbs, diagnosis, astrology, and medical theory. Their treatments weren't always effective by modern standards, but their role was incredibly important in a world plagued by epidemics, injuries, and poor sanitation. A medieval physician might travel extensively, advising monasteries, visiting patients in castles, or conducting research. Their education put them among the elite professionals of their society. Now imagine Hughes. What path does he choose? Let's say he chooses theology. He becomes a clerk for a bishop in northern France. His years of argumentation allow him to mediate disputes. His training in logic helps him interpret church law. His ability to read and write Latin makes him indispensable. And this is the truth. Nowhere in medieval society did people need literacy and logical training more than in government and the church. That's why medieval universities weren't isolated, they were intimately connected to power. And this connection wasn't accidental. Governments funded universities. Kings protected them. Popes granted them privileges. Merchants supported them. Cities tolerated them, grudgingly. Why? Because universities produced the people who ran medieval society. And here's something even more fascinating. Medieval university graduates became the intellectual class of Europe. They traveled across the continent, carrying ideas from one region to another. They debated, argued, translated, and wrote. They built bridges between cultures. This intellectual movement shaped the Renaissance. Let's zoom out and see the bigger picture. The Renaissance wasn't a sudden explosion of art and science. It was the result of centuries of slow, steady intellectual training in universities. Students learned how to analyze texts, challenge ideas, and debate philosophy. When new translations of ancient Greek works arrived from the Islamic world, these students were the first to read them, argue about them, and expand upon them. Universities gave Europe the intellectual tools to experience rebirth. Through logic, scholars learned how to question. Through grammar, they learned how to read ancient texts. Through rhetoric, they learned how to persuade. Through theology, they learned how to reconcile faith with reason. Through law, they learned how to build systems. Through medicine, they learned how to observe nature. Universities created the mindset that made the Renaissance possible. But what's even more surprising is the human side of the story, something rarely told in textbooks. Many medieval graduates remained emotionally connected to their university experience. They wrote poems about their struggles. They returned for festivals. They donated money to support new students. They funded scholarships. They visited old taverns, walked their old streets, and remembered those cold nights of study and survival. Medieval universities weren't just institutions, they were communities. And their impact didn't stop in the Middle Ages. Modern universities still reflect medieval traditions. Academic gowns. Degrees like bachelor, master, and doctor. Oral defenses. Faculty divisions. Latin mottos. Scholarly debates. Campus culture. Even the idea of academic freedom, protecting scholars from political interference, comes from the charter of medieval universities. But before we reach the final parts of our journey, there's one more powerful dimension we need to explore. The emotional legacy. The friendships. The loss. The personal triumphs and tragedies. And the human stories hidden behind medieval education. Because medieval universities weren't only engines of knowledge. They were places where young people became adults under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. In the next section, we're diving into the relationships, failures, heartbreaks, and personal transformations that defined the lives of medieval students and shaped the destiny of the world around them. We've walked through the danger, the learning, the politics, the exams, and the career paths, but now it's time to enter the most human part of this journey, the emotional world of medieval university students. Because beneath all the intellectual achievements, beneath the riots and the hunger and the brilliance, these students were still young people navigating friendships, love, heartbreak, ambition, fear, and identity. Let's return to Hughes one more time. He's survived years of study. He's passed brutal exams. He's earned respect in disputations. But the experience hasn't just shaped his mind, it has reshaped his heart, his friendships, and his understanding of the world. Because medieval universities were emotional pressure chambers. Imagine hundreds or thousands of young men, ages 13 to 25, crammed into the same neighborhoods, living in cheap lodgings, sharing meals, studying under stress, facing danger together, debating passionately, and bonding over shared hardship. It created deep friendships, sometimes lifelong ones. One of the era's most overlooked truths is how strong these student communities were. They formed nations, clubs, study groups, prayer circles, and sometimes secret drinking societies. They lent each other money, shared notes, split the costs of book rentals, and protected each other during street violence. Let's imagine Hughes' closest friends. Etienne, the son of a merchant from Picardy, always joking, always broke, always dreaming big. Lodovico from Italy, brilliant in logic but terrible with money, constantly arguing about Aristotle. Geoffroy, older than the rest, serious and disciplined, studying for the church, writing letters home every Sunday. These friendships were shaped by real struggle. They shared bread when one was starving. They took turns staying awake during late-night study sessions so at least one person could keep the candle from going out. They warned each other which streets were dangerous. They celebrated exam victories together. They pulled each other out of tavern fights. And sometimes they argued, loudly. Disagreements weren't just academic. They became emotional, personal, passionate. But through it all, something profound emerged, a sense of identity. For many medieval students, university wasn't just education, it was transformation. They arrived as children. They left as scholars. They came from isolated villages. They left with knowledge of the world. They arrived speaking only their local dialect. They left fluent in Latin, the language of international communication. But the emotional challenges were heavy. Homesickness was constant. Students wrote letters begging for money, describing hunger, cold, and loneliness. One student wrote, "I see others laughing, but I feel my soul is elsewhere." Another wrote, "I fear I may die here with no one to bury me." These letters reveal something raw. Behind the loud tavern songs and the intellectual battles, there was a quiet, aching vulnerability. Let's imagine Hughes writing his first letter home. "Mother, I am learning, but it is hard. I miss your bread. I miss our fire. The nights are cold. I beg you to pray for me." Even centuries later, these words feel familiar. Because every student knows the feeling of being overwhelmed, far from home, hoping the struggle is worth it. But there was also joy, real joy. Imagine Hughes and his friends celebrating after a successful disputation. They rush into a tavern, slamming their books on the table, ordering the cheapest wine they can afford. Etienne starts a song. Lodovico argues loudly about philosophy. Geoffroy warns them not to drink too much before Mass tomorrow. The tavern is filled with laughter, heat, and energy. These are the moments students remembered fondly for the rest of their lives. And then there were the deeper connections, the romantic ones. Even though universities were all male institutions, they existed in cities full of people. Students interacted with tavern workers, market sellers, servants, and townspeople. Romantic relationships happened, often secretly. The church strictly forbade certain relationships, especially with women considered improper. Students could be punished for breaking these rules. But that didn't stop them. Love letters from medieval students still survive, written awkwardly, beautifully, passionately. Some students wrote poetry comparing their beloved's eyes to stars or their presence to divine light. Others wrote desperate letters seeking forgiveness after heartbreak. One student wrote, "I know not whether I study or dream, for all thoughts return to you." Emotion ran deeply in medieval academic life, because intensity was everywhere. Intellectual intensity. Emotional intensity, social intensity, spiritual intensity. It was impossible to be indifferent. But everything wasn't joyful. Students also faced loss. Disease struck often, plague, fever, infections, and injuries. Some students didn't survive their university years. Some died far from home, buried quietly in the university cemetery, their families never seeing them again. Imagine the grief of Hughes and his friends if Geoffroy fell sick. They sit beside his straw bed in the cold room, praying. The candle burns low. A physician arrives with herbs and muttered prayers. But sometimes, despite everything, the illness wins. And the next morning, Hughes attends lecture with a heavy heart, the empty space beside him a reminder of how fragile life is. Loss shaped medieval student life as much as success. But even these tragedies reinforced the emotional bonds that made universities feel like families. Students comforted each other. Masters said prayers. The community mourned. And yet, through all of this, the joy, the fear, the danger, the stress, the ambition, the students kept going. Because they believed education could change their lives. And they were right. Medieval universities took farmers' sons, merchants' sons, orphan boys, noble sons, and turned them into physicians, judges, theologians, bishops, royal advisors, diplomats, and scholars whose ideas shaped the next 1,000 years. And now we're reaching the heart of our journey. After 9 parts and more than 9,000 words, we've seen student life from every angle. We've walked through muddy streets, dark taverns, crowded lecture rooms, freezing dorms, violent riots, spiritual debates, and emotional struggles. But one final part remains. The conclusion. The legacy. The answer to our original question. What was life really like at a medieval university, and why does it matter today? In the final section, we'll tie everything together with expert analysis, historical insight, modern comparisons, and a powerful ending that will resonate with viewers long after the video ends. After everything we've seen, everything we've walked through, the icy mornings, the brutal exams, the tavern fights, the hunger, the brilliance, the friendships, the losses, it's time to answer the question that started our journey. What was life really like at a medieval university? The answer is simple but not easy. It was hard. It was dangerous. It was chaotic. It was transformational. It was unlike anything we imagine today. And yet, it laid the foundation for every modern university on the planet. Let's bring all the threads together. When a medieval student first arrived, young, afraid, hopeful, he stepped into a world filled with contradictions. Universities promised knowledge but delivered hardship. They promised discipline but delivered chaos. They promised structure but lived in conflict. They promised safety but exposed students to real danger. Yet somehow, through all of this, they became one of the greatest inventions of the Middle Ages. Why? Because medieval universities created a new kind of person, a person trained to think. Before universities, most learning in Europe was confined to monasteries and noble courts. Knowledge moved slowly, often guarded, rarely questioned. But universities changed that. They created a system where ideas could be debated, not just received. Arguments could challenge authority. Logic could test tradition. Text could confront text. Students could rise through talent, not just birth. Universities democratized knowledge long before democracy became political. They brought together people from every region: France, Italy, England, Spain, Germany, Flanders. They blended cultures. They shared ideas. They spread innovations. They carried texts across borders. They built the intellectual bridges that Europe needed to move toward the Renaissance. And the emotional journey of these students was just as transformative. A boy like Hughes entered university frightened, unsure, physically weak, unsure of his place in the world. Years later, he left as someone entirely different: disciplined, literate, logical, worldly, confident, and equipped to shape society. Thousands of young men experienced this transformation. Some became priests who guided communities. Some became legal scholars who wrote laws that still influence courts today. Some became physicians who cared for the sick. Some became philosophers who shaped the intellectual foundations of Europe. Some became teachers who passed knowledge to the next generation. And some never survived the journey at all, lost to violence, illness, or poverty. Their stories remind us that medieval education had a cost. But for those who endured, the medieval university was a crucible. A place where minds were forged under pressure. A place where the future was written one argument at a time. And here's something powerful to consider. Every modern classroom, every college campus, every graduation ceremony, every academic debate, every library, every degree, traces its roots back to those chaotic, muddy, candlelit, dangerous medieval streets. The bachelor's degree? Medieval. The master's degree? Medieval. The doctoral defense? Medieval. The academic gown and hood? Medieval. The lecture structure? Medieval. Even student pranks? Medieval. We are living with the legacy of a world far more passionate, troubled, and alive than we often imagine. So what was life really like at a medieval university? It was a mix of struggle and brilliance, of hunger and hope, of discipline and rebellion, of argument and discovery. of fear and ambition, of youth and transformation. It was a world where knowledge meant survival, where education meant opportunity, and where students risked their lives to learn. And that brings us to the final part of our journey, our why. Why does this story matter today? Because, in many ways, medieval university students were just like students now. They worried about exams. They worried about money. They stayed up too late. They tried to impress their teachers. They argued with friends. They explored who they wanted to become. They felt lonely. They felt excited. They felt overwhelmed. They held dreams larger than their circumstances. We may live in a different age, but the emotional heart of student life hasn't changed. And maybe that's why these stories resonate so deeply, because when we strip away the swords, the cloaks, the candles, and the Latin, we're left with something universal. Young people trying to understand the world and their place in it. That's the true legacy of medieval universities. Now, as we wrap up this incredible journey across 10,000 words and 10 parts, here's where we turn to you, the viewers, the thinkers, the curious minds who make these stories worth telling. If you've enjoyed stepping back in time and seeing what life was really like for the students who built the academic world we live in today, then you know what to do. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another historical deep dive. Tap the like button, because it really helps the channel grow and bring more stories to life. And drop a comment telling me what surprised you the most about medieval university life. Was it the danger? The discipline? The friendships? The exams? The emotional struggle? I read every comment and I love hearing what you think. Thanks for being part of this global community. Thanks for traveling through history with me. And thanks for bringing your curiosity, because that's what keeps stories like these alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next story.